A few years ago, when DSLRs were still dominating the market of wildlife photographers, the Nikon D500 and also the 200 to 500 mm f5.6 lens from Nikon, this was a very popular combination because you had a fast frame rate, a very good autofocus, a crop body, good image quality, and everything in a somehow affordable and not too heavy package. And I think many Nikon shooters have since been waiting for a mirrorless replacement of this combination. And the Nikon Z50 that was announced several years ago was definitely not a replacement of the D500. And when Nikon announced the Z50 Mark II a few weeks ago, it became clear that it's actually also not a replacement. If you actually compare the body size, you can already see that the D500 is still a more professional body. It has a joystick, it has a dual card slot, bigger battery, the list goes on. Nevertheless, after using the Z50 Mark II for a while and also comparing them side by side in the field, I still think that for most people the Z50 Mark II might be the better camera. And in this video I want to talk about the advantages that I see with the camera, the dislikes that I had, and also give a recommendation to whom it might be interesting to upgrade from a D500 or similar DSLR, maybe with the 200 to 500 mm lens, to the mirrorless version, the Z50 Mark II and the 180 to 600 mm lens. I don't want to make this video too technical, but let's just look at the most important specs of the Nikon Z50 Mark II. We have a 20.7 megapixel APS-C or DX sensor with a crop factor of 1.5. We have a viewfinder with 2.36 million dots and a magnification of 0.68 if you convert it to full frame cameras. We have this amazing eye autofocus that the Nikon Z8 and Z9 have. I will discuss a bit more about that afterwards. We get up to 11 frames per second with the mechanical or first electronic shutter. The electronic shutter, the completely electronic shutter, can do a bit more, but with some limitations, like we only have JPEG. With the electronic shutter, you're also limited to a shutter speed of 1/2000th of a second or longer, which for action is not always great. This body only weighs 550 grams and you can buy it for 999 euros, and I think the dollar price is the same. Now, if I compare the handling of the D500 and the Z50 Mark II, what I realized obviously immediately is that the Z50 Mark II is much lighter and it's also smaller. So this can have advantages and disadvantages. If I shoot with long telephoto lenses, I usually prefer a bit a bigger body. You can see that my pinky here doesn't have much room. Otherwise, I still think it feels quite good in the hands. You have like two wheels to change, or two dials to change the settings like we know it from basically all Nikon cameras. You have some custom, like some user modes, U1, U2 and U3 that you can put here. You have the screen that can be tilted in basically all directions, and this was actually one of the biggest differences that I noticed when I was shooting both cameras side by side, how convenient it is in some situations. If you are laying down close to a river or basically at a river or lake and the shore is not completely flat, it's so nice just being able to shoot over the screen. Of course, the D500 was also able to shoot over the screen using the live view, but there we were kind of restricted to AFS and we didn't have AFC, so the continuous autofocus. So for moving animals, it was basically useless. So that's a huge improvement right here. What is also a great improvement is with the electronic viewfinder to be able to see how bright your image will be in the end. I had this especially on a day where it was a bit a mix between overcast and sunny, and I was shooting manually and I was changing the ISOs quite often, and this was a bit more tricky, or I just needed to think a bit more with the D500. I think with the Z50 Mark II, this is just a bit more convenient, and especially for other beginner photographers, it can just be something less to worry about because you immediately see the effect of the exposure that you have. One downside I noticed when taking like more flight shots was that the blackout that we have here when shooting a burst of shots, it seemed a bit more pronounced than on the D500. So both have the blackout when the shutter closes. I just felt on the Z50 Mark II it was a bit more pronounced. Another negative thing that I noticed about the Z50 II is that the battery is really not the best. It's the ELEN25A battery, a rather small battery, and usually it was okay, but one morning it was rather fresh. I just quickly checked at home and I still had all the bars on the battery, so I assumed it was quite okay, even though it was not fully charged, but good enough. And after not even 20 minutes of shooting, the battery started to blink red. And I've seen similar things with Canon cameras like the R10 that use these tiny batteries. The smaller the battery, from my experience, just the less reliable they are. So if you buy this camera, I would recommend just getting 2 spare batteries, that you have a total of 3 batteries, and then I think you should be quite fine, especially since the camera can be charged over USB-C, but obviously this only makes sense if you're not really using the camera at this point. In terms of image quality, I mentioned that both have a 20.7 megapixel sensor. It's not the fastest readout. This is why with the Z50 Mark II you will basically use the electronic first curtain or the mechanical shutter for almost all of your work. In terms of image quality, I think they are both quite good for being crop sensors. I didn't have a lot of time to compare the image quality between the two. I think the Z50 Mark II is a bit better, but I didn't care too much about that. Anyway, they're both crop sensors, so as soon as you start pushing the ISO, you might need to apply a bit more noise reduction. I think the biggest difference between these two cameras was how the autofocus works. So the D500 had a great autofocus for the time. It basically inherited the autofocus from the D850, if I'm not mistaken. And because it's a crop camera, you had autofocus fields until almost the edge of the frame, which for DSLRs was really special. The Z50 Mark II, on the other hand, it's just another level. I mean, here we have this subject detection. We can choose between different subjects we want to detect, and the Z50 Mark II has the bird detection that the Z9 and Z8 have, and the Z6 Mark III doesn't have. So in terms of recognition of the subject, I really had the feeling that the Z50 Mark II was basically on the level of a Z8 or Z9 and clearly above the Z6 Mark III. In terms of tracking, I think it was a bit less consistent as the professional Nikon cameras, but for a camera of this price point, still very good, and I got a lot of keepers. I think the biggest problem I had when taking pictures of birds in flight was actually the blackout that I mentioned just before. The camera is also quite fast. It shoots 11 frames per second with the mechanical or first electronic shutter. And of course, this is not setting any records, but again, for a camera of this price point, this is very fast. In the DSLR times, a camera of this price point will probably shoot around 5 frames per second. The next very positive thing is the buffer. So I tried to fill the buffer. I put the SD card in there. I put it to the 11 frames per second. I held down the shutter button, and it took almost 20 seconds until the camera was stopping. And afterwards I discovered that actually the camera is kind of restricted to doing 200 images in a series, and then it will stop. This is to prevent that if you have the camera somehow in the backpack and something is touching the shutter and the camera is still powered on, that it basically takes endless images. So if I would have let go and restarted, I could have continued shooting. But anyway, I think almost 200 or 200 frames, which is almost 200 which is almost 20 seconds. That's a very long time, and that's a great value. So I can really only applaud Nikon for including such a good buffer in this camera. Please note that I did these buffer tests with the high efficiency star raw, so obviously if you choose other file formats, the buffer might vary a bit. The camera is also very well suited for filming. It's no comparison to the D500, where we always needed to film over the display. It was not possible to film over the viewfinder. The autofocus was basically not existing, and this here is something else with the bird tracking in the filming as well. And I like how you switch from video to movie with this small lever up here. That's super convenient. You have up to 4K 60. If you go to full HD, you can have 120 frames per second. You have no record limit, so this was actually quite cool as well. So if you're coming from a D500, D7500 or another DSLR camera and you want to have a crop camera and want to go mirrorless, is the Z50 Mark II a good idea? I think for most of the people, yes. As I mentioned, being able to see your exposure, having this amazing autofocus, having still a fast frame rate, the camera is highly customizable, you have this tiltable screen. I think these are all great benefits. There are some advantages, as I mentioned before, where the D500 is still better. And obviously, I think all of us were kind of hoping that Nikon would bring a Z500, basically a true successor of the D500, like in a bigger body, maybe the body of a Z6 Mark III or even Z8 with dual card slots, with an even faster frame rate, maybe a stacked sensor, a bigger viewfinder, and the list goes on. However, even though I have no inside information whatsoever, I'm not super optimistic that this will happen anytime soon. So I think it's maybe the time to switch to mirrorless. I think especially for this price, you don't lose much actually. In terms of lenses, you can of course continue to use a 200 to 500 on the Z50 Mark II just with the adapter. I did some tests last year and I was still much happier with the 180 to 600 because it's an internal zoom. You can quickly zoom there. It has better image stabilization, better image quality, and you have 100mm extra focal length. So maybe check out the video that I put below. If you want to buy the camera, I would be very happy if you do it over the affiliate links below to support me, and let me know in the comments what you think about this camera here.